Carl Jung documented a psychological paradox so unsettling that to this day it continues to haunt those who carry the gift of empathy. What should be their greatest strength, the ability to feel deeply and illuminate the emotional darkness of others, also becomes the root of their most devastating pain. Jung discovered that highly sensitive people unconsciously attract individuals who project onto them everything they reject within themselves. It is as if the empath's light were a ruthless mirror, capable of exposing wounds many have spent a lifetime trying to bury. At first, the empath is seen as magnetic, almost indispensable. But inevitably, that same light awakens hostility, criticism, and even abandonment. For Jung, this was not merely a pattern of troubled relationships. It was an archetypal phenomenon, an invisible battle between authenticity and the shadow, between emotional life and inner death. He believed this destiny could lead down one of two paths: either completely destroy the sensitive soul, or transform them into an indispensable guardian of humanity's psychological evolution. Today, we will reveal Jung's darkest discovery about empaths, and why your sensitivity was never a weakness, but a trial by fire. In his years of clinical practice, Carl Jung began to notice a troubling pattern in certain patients who possessed extraordinary sensitivity. They were individuals capable of sensing another person's pain without a single word being spoken. They had the rare gift of creating a space where others, often for the first time, felt truly seen and understood. But over time, Jung began to observe something strange. These same individuals who attracted trust, confessions, and gratitude ended up becoming targets of criticism, rejection, and even hostility from the very people who had benefited most from their presence. It was as if the flame that drew moths in would inevitably burn them as well. Jung noted that the more authentic and radiant an empath became, the more they threatened the psychological defenses of others. Their emotional spontaneity exposed the emotional rigidity of those who had lost contact with their own soul. And instead of recognizing this as a call to transformation, many reacted with resentment and contempt. He described this phenomenon as shadow projection, when someone casts onto another what they cannot bear to see within themselves. For Jung, this was not a simple case of dysfunctional relationships, but a deep, unconscious, repetitive, and destructive mechanism. By illuminating another person's hidden wound, the empath became the scapegoat in an inner battle that was never theirs to begin with. These observations led Jung to a disturbing conclusion. The very quality that makes the empath essential for collective healing is also the reason they are so often punished for their own light. From these observations, Jung began to recognize a recurring pattern that I call the empath shadow paradox. It's a cruel paradox. The more genuine and luminous the empath's emotional expression becomes, the more it awakens in others what has been buried, forgotten, or rejected within their own hearts. It's as if the empath's presence were a living mirror, reflecting not only what the other person wants to show, but also what they desperately try to hide. At first, that light is irresistible. Emotionally disconnected people are drawn to it, like exhausted travelers who find warmth in the middle of darkness. But when they realize that the same warmth is beginning to reveal their shadows, admiration gives way to criticism. And the empath, once seen as a blessing, becomes a burden, accused of being too intense, too sensitive, too complicated. Jung saw in this cycle one of the greatest tragedies of the psyche: the fact that authenticity awakens not only healing, but also hatred. And what's most disturbing is that the empath does nothing except be themselves. It's their sheer existence, whole, connected, and alive, that threatens the fortress of emotional defenses others built just to survive. That's why Jung insisted this pattern wasn't an individual problem, but a collective one. Humanity fears those who still carry the flame of authenticity because that flame reveals the darkness so many have grown used to living in. And if you recognize this paradox in your own life, know that this channel is a space dedicated to decoding Jung's discoveries about the shadow, empathy, and the human mind. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. With every video, we go deeper into the hidden layers of the psyche, bringing to light secrets that can transform not only how you see yourself, but how you see the world around you. Imagine someone who carries within them a rare light, the ability to see beyond masks and feel what no one dares to confess. That someone is the empath. At first, their presence feels like a balm. Friends, partners, and even strangers draw near as if they've found a refuge. They share secrets they've never told anyone, cry in their presence, and say they feel an inexplicable relief simply by being close. But Jung observed that after this initial enchantment, a dramatic shift almost always occurs. The very person who once said, "I've never met anyone like you," begins to criticize, belittle, and even despise the empath. Suddenly, their intensity becomes a problem. Their sensitivity is labeled a weakness, and the bond that began in admiration ends in rejection. Jung was unequivocal. This is not random. It is the shadow projection at work. The empath's emotional authenticity silently exposes the fragile defenses and hidden wounds of others. And when faced with that uncomfortable mirror, many would rather attack the one who reflects it than confront what has been revealed. This cruel dynamic creates a psychological prison. Seeking acceptance, the empath begins to wonder if something is truly wrong with them. Little by little, they risk suffocating their own authenticity just to fit into the emotionally anesthetized world around them. This is where Jung warns us. The danger is not in feeling too much, but in believing that other people's pain means you must feel less. Jung observed that whenever an empath remains faithful to their authenticity, 4 types of figures tend to appear along their path. They represent different expressions of projected shadow, and they all share one thing in common. They try to extinguish the flame the empath keeps alive. 1. The emotion critic. This is the one who ridicules feelings. They grew up believing that emotion is weakness, and so they suppressed their own sensitivity until it was nearly extinguished. When they encounter someone who still feels deeply, they respond with mockery. "You're too dramatic. You're overreacting." In truth, every laugh or cutting remark reveals nothing more than their discomfort at seeing, in someone else, the part of themselves they had to bury. 2. The authenticity attacker. This one lives behind social masks. They've built their identity around a persona that appears perfect, controlled, and well-adapted. So when they come face-to-face with an empath's transparency, they feel threatened. They criticize their spontaneity, saying it's inappropriate, that they don't know how to behave. In reality, the empath simply awakens their envy, the envy of not knowing how to be real. 3. The vulnerability violator. This is the most dangerous. They approach the empath precisely because they recognize their openness and trust. But instead of honoring it, they weaponize that vulnerability. They exploit, manipulate, and in the end, blame the empath for having trusted too much. This is the classic emotional predator who punishes what they can no longer feel themselves, the purity of trust. 4. The light diminisher. This one doesn't attack directly. Their strategy is subtler, almost invisible. Little by little, they erode the empath's self-esteem by planting seeds of doubt. Are you sure you're not overreacting? Maybe your empathy is actually a flaw. The goal is to weaken them quietly until the empath begins to believe their gift is, in fact, a burden. Jung recognized in this type the most insidious shadow of all, the one that tries to slowly extinguish another person's inner light. When the empath recognizes these 4 adversaries, they begin to understand that they are not crazy nor too sensitive. They are, in truth, confronting the unconscious projections of those who cannot bear to see in others what they have lost within themselves. And here is a powerful reminder. You do not need to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's emptiness. If you've already identified any of these figures in your life, Write in the comments, "I will no longer dim my light." That is the first step in breaking the cycle. Name the enemy, recognize the shadow's game, and choose to remain whole. Jung warned that the true danger for the empath does not lie only in external attacks, but in what those attacks can trigger within their own psyche. The shadow projected by others can gradually turn into self-sabotage, and this is the point at which the gift risks becoming a lasting curse. Risk 1. The erosion of authenticity. Weary of criticism, the empath begins to hide their true nature. They suppress tears, feign indifference, tone down their intensity just to be accepted. But in doing so, they lose what Jung called the authentic feeling function, the living contact with the soul. It is the beginning of emotional death. Risk 2. Psychological self-betrayal. Over time, external criticism becomes internalized. The empath starts to believe they really do feel too much, that something is inherently wrong with them. They begin attacking themselves with the same violence others once directed at them. Jung described this state as a devastating inner split. The individual becomes an enemy of their own essence. Risk 3. Collective stagnation. Most tragic of all is that when empaths dim themselves, it is not only their own lives that lose meaning. Humanity as a whole suffers. Jung saw empaths as emotional pioneers, those who keep the flame of authenticity alive. When they yield to the pressure of others' shadows, the collective loses its guides, and psychological evolution is halted. That is why Jung insisted, protecting your own light is not selfishness, it is responsibility. Because every time an empath abandons their authenticity, it is not just one soul that falls silent, but an essential part of humanity's future that is silenced along with it. Carl Jung did not limit himself to describing the suffering empaths endure in the face of shadow projections. He believed that those who carry this gift need a clear strategy, so they do not lose themselves in the emotional chaos of others. We can call this process the authentic self-preservation protocol. It consists of 3 essential phases that allow the empath to remain alive in their essence without becoming captive to someone else's pain. Phase 1. Recognizing the projection. The first step is understanding that hostility is not personal. Carl Jung stated that much of the criticism directed at the empath does not reflect their truth, but the psychic condition of the one projecting. The empath must see that phrases like, "you're too intense," or "you care too much," reveal the other person's wound, not their own identity. This recognition creates an invisible shield. The empath stops absorbing as truth what is, in reality, a distorted reflection of someone else's shadow. Phase 2. Psychological boundaries. Carl Jung referred to this as psychological discernment. It means remaining open to life, but with clarity about what is authentic feedback and what is unconscious attack. The empath must learn to say no, to refuse toxic bonds, and to protect their vital energy. This is not about building stone walls, but about creating a selective membrane, allowing in what nourishes and blocking what corrodes. Phase 3. The conscious choice of bonds. For Carl Jung, healing never happens in total isolation. The empath must form what he called a vibrational sanctuary, relationships with people who value and strengthen their authenticity rather than trying to extinguish it. Within this safe circle, the empath finds the space to flourish without fear. More than self-protection, this is about consciously choosing who deserves closeness and who must remain at a distance. This protocol is not just theory, it is daily practice. It is remembering, with every criticism received, that projection speaks more about the critic than about the one who feels. It is maintaining firm boundaries without letting the heart die. It is selecting bonds that strengthen rather than drain. If you are ready to apply this protocol in your own life, write in the comments, "I know the difference between truth and shadow." That declaration is more than a sentence. It is a public commitment that you will no longer allow someone else's shadow to determine the destiny of your light. Carl Jung always believed that the patterns he observed in his patients were not merely individual phenomena, but expressions of universal archetypes. That is why, throughout his life, he analyzed not only ordinary individuals, but also historical and cultural figures who embodied the same struggle, preserving authenticity in a world that rejects it. One example Carl Jung frequently mentioned was San Francisco de Assis. Francis radiated a radical empathy, an emotional openness that defied the rigid norms of his time. His contemporaries, including religious authorities, accused him of being naive, of feeling too much. But instead of withdrawing, Francis transformed his sensitivity into concrete action, caring for the poor, embracing the marginalized, and living authenticity as a testimony. Carl Jung saw in him a rare case of integration, someone who faced criticism without extinguishing his own flame. In contrast, Carl Jung also studied the life of Vincent van Gogh, a man whose extreme sensitivity produced works of art that still moved the collective unconscious, yet at the same time made him vulnerable to contempt and misunderstanding. Van Gogh's letters reveal how he was constantly criticized for being too intense, overly emotional. Without what Carl Jung described as a vibrational sanctuary, Van Gogh ultimately turned against himself, attacking his own sensitivity until it became unbearable. Van Gogh's story illustrates the tragic fate of many empaths who internalize external criticism. Francis, on the other hand, represents the alternative path, sensitivity transformed into strength, even in the face of rejection. And finally, Carl Jung himself acknowledged this battle within his own life. He knew that his ability to see deeply into the human psyche provoked resistance and even hostility among his colleagues. But rather than suppressing that vision, Carl Jung chose to defend it, even at the cost of isolation. These examples reveal a central truth. The empath will always face shadow projection, but the ultimate destiny depends on a choice. Either sensitivity becomes a destructive burden, or it turns into a flame that illuminates generations. Carl Jung taught that no empath can survive in isolation. For him, sensitivity requires a vibrational sanctuary, a relational space where authenticity is not merely tolerated, but celebrated. Without that, the empath's flame risks slowly fading under the weight of criticism and rejection. But how do you recognize these allies? Carl Jung described 3 essential profiles of people capable of sustaining an empath's light. 1. Other empaths. Here, recognition is immediate. It is as if 2 souls meet and exhale in relief. You feel this too. These relationships are marked by mutual understanding and the absence of judgment. 2. Psychologically evolved individuals. Not all of them are empaths, but some have done deep inner work. They have learned to integrate their own shadows, and therefore do not feel threatened by another person's authenticity. Carl Jung affirmed that these bonds act as bridges. They help the empath connect to the world without having to hide. 3. Guardians of authenticity. These are people who, even if they do not share the same intensity, recognize the value of sensitivity. They do not try to change the empath, but stand beside them as quiet protectors of the flame. And what are the signs? According to Carl Jung, true allies do not mock emotions, criticize intensity, or manipulate vulnerability. They ask questions with genuine curiosity, respect boundaries, protect emotional energy, and reinforce that sensitivity is a strength, not a flaw. Recognizing these allies is essential, because they are the ones who allow the empath to remain whole in a world that insists on fragmenting them. Without them, loneliness can suffocate. With them, authenticity flourishes. Carl Jung believed that the empath's journey does not end with recognizing enemies or protecting themselves from projection. He saw the sensitive life as a process of integration, one in which pain is transformed into strength, and authenticity stops being a burden and becomes a mission. This journey can be understood in 4 stages. Stage 1. Recognition without suppression. The first step is to stop believing that feeling deeply is a flaw. Carl Jung said, "Wisdom begins when we stop confusing another person's light with our own darkness." The empath learns that the criticism they receive does not reveal an excess of emotion, but a lack of emotion in others. Mantra: I do not feel too much. The world feels too little. Stage 2. Boundaries without hardening. Creating boundaries does not mean building walls. Carl Jung spoke of conscious permeability, remaining open to love and to life, but not to the poison of projection. It is like healthy skin, allowing in what nourishes and blocking what intoxicates. Mantra: I open my heart to what is real. I close it to what destroys. Stage 3. Community, without compromising the essence. Many empaths lose themselves trying to be accepted by those who reject authenticity. Carl Jung warned that the need for approval can lead to inner death. The true leap is to stop seeking acceptance from everyone and instead choose to build a small but genuine community. Mantra: I would rather be whole for a few than fragmented for many. Stage 4. Service without self-sacrifice. At the highest level, the empath discovers that their sensitivity is not only for themselves. It is medicine for a world made ill by indifference. But serving does not mean sacrificing yourself to the point of exhaustion. Carl Jung emphasized the importance of giving from abundance, not from lack. The integrated empath offers their light to those who can receive it, and does not feel guilty for those who reject it. Mantra: I serve with my light, but I do not extinguish my flame. These 4 stages form the backbone of the integration Carl Jung advocated. Each step is a call for the empath to stop hiding, stop emotionally mutilating themselves, and begin living as what they have always been, a guardian of authenticity in a world that has forgotten how to feel. Carl Jung warned that even when the empath begins the journey of integration, there are subtle traps that can derail the process. They are like psychological alleyways that seem to offer protection,
Trap 4.
but ultimately lead back
light.
to the same darkness
This
the
is the most
empath was
painful
trying
trap
to
of all.
avoid. Here, the
Trap
empath
1.
understands the
Revenge.
theory, grasps
After
projection,
so much rejection,
recognizes
many
the
empaths
dynamics,
feel the urge
but
to
out
give
of
the
fear of
pain
further
back.
attacks,
They criticize
chooses to
those who
suppress their
criticize
light,
them,
mock other people's coldness, attack what they call dead hearts. But as Carl Jung said, what we fight most intensely, we eventually become. When the empath chooses revenge, they begin to mirror the very shadow that wounded them. Trap 2. Spiritual superiority. Some, after understanding the dynamics of projection, develop a kind of enlightened arrogance. They begin to believe they are more evolved than others simply because they still feel deeply. Carl Jung saw this as a new kind of mask, just as dangerous as the old one. The gift of empathy is not meant to create hierarchy, but to serve as a bridge. Trap 3. Total isolation. Tired of being hurt, the empath may decide to cut off all connections. They retreat into a cocoon, believing this will keep them safe. Carl Jung warned that absolute isolation does not produce healing, it produces stagnation. Without exchange, sensitivity withers, and the flame meant to illuminate slowly fades. Intellectually aware, yet emotionally dead. Carl Jung considered this the greatest failure of the journey, when someone knows their sensitivity is a gift, yet continues to live as if it were a curse. Recognizing these traps is vital, because they do not appear in obvious form but as subtle temptations along the path, and choosing to avoid them is what separates the fragmented empath from the one who truly becomes a beacon. Carl Jung reminded us that integration is not a permanent state, but an ongoing process. Just as a fire must be fed daily to keep from going out, the empath's inner flame also requires constant care. That care begins with regularly evaluating one's relationships. Asking yourself, does this connection nourish me or drain me? Does this person strengthen my authenticity or push me back into a mask? Carl Jung said that honesty in answering these questions is the first step in preserving the self. Another essential aspect is energetic discernment. Not every pain needs to be absorbed. The empath must distinguish between suffering that can be transformed into compassion and burdens that were never theirs to carry. The difference lies in noticing whether the interaction creates expansion or simply erodes vitality over time. Finally, Carl Jung emphasized the importance of conscious community. Turning toward those who recognize the value of sensitivity is not weakness, but a survival strategy. The empath was not meant to live in isolation, but to share their light with those who are able to receive it. Keeping the inner fire alive means this: choosing, day after day, to protect authenticity from external shadow and from the inner temptation to extinguish it. Because as Carl Jung taught, the empath does not illuminate the world by hiding their flame, but by preserving it until others remember to rekindle their own. For Carl Jung, the empath's journey was never merely personal. He saw each sensitive individual as part of something far greater, humanity's movement toward a more authentic consciousness. That is why, when an empath is silenced, it is not only one life that suffers. The entire collective loses access to a different future. Carl Jung described empaths as emotional pioneers. They carry within them a psychic function that many have lost along the way, the ability to feel without filters, to connect directly with the soul. And for that reason, they become an uncomfortable reminder of everything society tries to suppress in the name of efficiency, control, and image. But Carl Jung also believed that this very discomfort is essential for progress. The empath exposes wounds that need healing, reveals contradictions that can no longer be hidden, and embodies living proof that sensitivity is not weakness, but power. When the empath preserves their authenticity, they do more than protect themselves. They become a beacon for others, a reminder that it is still possible to live connected to one's inner truth. And every empath who chooses to remain whole paves the way for others to do the same. On a collective level, preserving empathic authenticity is the key to breaking the cycle of emotional stagnation that Carl Jung so deeply feared. Because without these guardians of sensitivity, the world will remain blind to its own shadows. But with them, humanity can, little by little, learn how to feel again. Carl Jung documented with unsettling precision the traps so many empaths fall into. They are loved at the beginning and hated in the end, celebrated as a safe harbor only to be rejected as if they were the problem. And all for one simple reason: authenticity always reveals the shadow others refuse to see. In this video, we explored how Carl Jung identified the 4 enemies that attack the empath: the emotion critic, the authenticity attacker, the vulnerability violator, and the light diminisher. We also examined the 3 mortal risks: the erosion of authenticity, psychological self-betrayal, and collective stagnation. And we learned the 3-phase protocol, recognition, boundaries, and conscious bonds, that Carl Jung believed was essential for preserving the self. The journey is not easy. There are traps of revenge, arrogance, and isolation. But there is also a path of integration in 4 stages: recognize without suppressing, set boundaries without hardening, build community without compromising your essence, and serve without self-sacrifice. In the end, what Carl Jung left us with is a revelation that still echoes today. The empath does not feel too much. The world feels too little. And that is precisely why humanity needs those who can still sustain the flame of authenticity. So if you have ever wondered whether your sensitivity is a burden, remember this: for Carl Jung, it was never a flaw. It is the key to your individuation, and perhaps the only hope for a more human future. If you've made it this far, it's because you carry within you the same sensitivity Carl Jung described in his deepest writings. And I want to hear from you. Which of the 4 enemies of empathy have you faced most in your life? Write it in the comments. Your voice may echo as guidance for other empaths seeking to understand their own journey. If this video brought you clarity, subscribe to the channel now. With every new piece of content, we dive together into Carl Jung's discoveries, unveiling mysteries of the psyche that transform not only how you see yourself, but how you see the world. Your subscription is what keeps this flame alive and strengthens a community of seekers of inner truth. Keep watching the next videos. Each revelation is a new key to deciphering the shadows. I'll see you in the shadows of the next hidden truth.